What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to CLAO's Network. Today I am discussing how to select a deck for a tournament, and that will involve analyzing the metagame, predicting what the metagame will look like, and deciding where you want to take your wins and losses. I'll be doing this by showing you the content I provided for my patrons over at patreon.com/CLAO's Network leading up to Players Cup 3 Top 256. I also provided information for the Players Cup qualifiers as well. I cover just about every major event that my patrons may be participating in over on Patreon with my outlook, my perspective, my ideas, all the information and data that I can provide in the analysis. So since this information is now outdated, since it was all for Players Cup 3, I'm showing it publicly so you guys can get a little bit of a preview what my patrons see, Patreon, it's a mess, what my patrons see, but also doing it in an educational way to just generally explain how I go about selecting a deck and analyzing a meta in the Pokemon TCG in 2021. So without further ado, of course, shout out to my sponsor, PoTownStore.com. If you need PTCGO codes, head over there and use code CLAO for 5% off. Subscribe to this channel if you're new. My Patreon link is in the description down below. It's currently $3 a month to support me and get access to all of my posts. This may go up to $5 in the future, since I've been told $3 is kind of low, and looking around, it looks like $5 is kind of the regular, but for now it's $3, and if you join at $3, you'll be locked in at that price for life. So yeah, this is my Patreon homepage, and let's look at the content and talk about how I selected a deck and my thoughts going into Players Cup 3 on selecting a deck, and exactly how I, how the brain works for me when I'm thinking about deck selection. So first of all, the first step that you don't even really see here, because it went into the preparation of writing this article, was the lists. So part of being a patron of mine is you get access to a spreadsheet where all of my current lists for the current standard format are in there with notes and PTCGO exports, and I update them regularly whenever I update my lists. So every deck I'm currently working on, testing, or considering playing is in that spreadsheet, and you have access to that. And also, whenever a tournament is coming up, I do a matchup spreadsheet as well, which I will click here, and the link should still work. So, and you'll see something like this, where I estimate the unweighted and weighted matchup spreads, the meta shares, the matchups of all of the stuff. Now, of course, like I said, this is outdated. This was for the Shining Fates metagame, but this is kind of what I provide with this, and this is what I make for myself. I've been making these for 3 or 4 years now, even before I had a channel and before I had a Patreon and things like that. So the first thing I do is hash out my lists. Now with this, it was pretty easy because we just had Shining Fates added, so there were like 2 cards to consider. There was like Rusted Sword, Galarian Wheezing, maybe something else that I'm forgetting, but it was very minor changes to make. So the list preparation part was very easy for Players Cup 3 Top 256 because all that was added was Shining Fates. So let's decide how decks are built optimally. That's step 1. So you want to have all of your lists ready so you can make accurate matchup spreads and accurate testing, accurate preparation. Next, decide what you think the most popular decks are going to be. So that was kind of the next step, and that's the first step here in this post. I talked about estimating the matchups between the top 10 decks for the North American Top 256 portion, and you have to keep in mind a lot of variables when you're looking at this. So what I said here was these estimations are expected to be more accurate for the North American region, although it should translate fairly well to other regions. And the matchup spreads here and the meta share predictions here are less relevant for the team challenge than they are for the Players Cup 3 Top 256, but they still can be fairly relevant and valid, just not fully, because that's not what they were made for. So using the matchup spreadsheet and the meta shares, I estimated that on paper, these 5 decks had the best matchup spreads for Players Cup 3 Top 256. Now, this was March 8th, so this was let's see, let's check the calendar. How many days away from the actual event was that? So the event started on the 16th. So this was, no, the event started on the 13th. So this was 5 days before deck lists were due and 6 days before we played that this went up. So at 5 to 6 days before the event, I estimated that Mad Party, Poison Eternatus, Decidueye, Blacephalon, and Centiskorch had the best matchup spreads on the spreadsheet. Now, estimating this is great, but just seeing what's good on paper in matchups doesn't tell you everything, because one thing that the matchup spreadsheet doesn't take into account is consistency. Now, this can vary by player skill, how well you're piloting it to make the deck work optimally. It can also vary based on your deck list that you choose to play. Decigoons, something I noted here. Now, there's frequently going to be a deck like this in a format. Decigoons is a deck with very polarizing matchups, which is an external factor to keep in mind. Although it has some great matchups and some awful matchups that when averaged out spit out a positive matchup spread, you could realistically hit 2 of the bad matchups in a row, and then the positive matchups never end up mattering. So in a double elimination format like Players Cup 3, which Players Cup 4 will not be double elimination at this point, as they announced, even though Decigoons on average had like a 55% matchup spread, so above average, that's on average if it actually played against every deck. Now, in a tournament like this, you're not going to play against every deck, so that polarizing matchup spread was something to keep in mind. So that is quantitative data. So as far as the meta share predictions, I expected ADPZ, Eternatus Variant, Centiskorch, and Pikarom to be the most popular decks in the field, so those were the ones I was preparing for the most. Something that made the deck, that made this difficult was deciding if people would switch from straight Eternatus to Poison Eternatus, since they have drastically different matchup spreads in some cases. Now let's go over to the next one, March 17th. Actually, wait, no, I made a mistake. The Players Cup 3 256 started on March 20th. So, okay, so this was posted 12 days before the tournament started, and this was posted 3 days before the tournament started. So this was like the latest update I would be giving my patrons. At this point, I decided in the matchup spread, since the top 256 of PC3 was double elimination and less matchups mattered, and also this is not a regional or international event where everybody can enter. This was just 256 people. I made an update to the matchup spread where I only took into account the top 6 decks in this row. You'll see it says weighted only top 6 popularity. And some of the matchups definitely changed with that. And so here I say that with this change, the top 6 decks against the most popular decks are ADPZ, Eternatus, I'm sorry, the most popular decks I estimated would be ADPZ, Eternatus Hammers, Centiskorch, Blound, Pika, and Luke Metal. And these were the decks that I wanted to be most prepared for and would expect to play against. Now, a lot of things really go into deciding that these will be the top 6 decks. And I've been playing the Pokemon TCG for many years. And so a lot of experience that I've just gathered over the time has helped me to estimate what the meta will look like and what shifts will happen. And that's kind of the advantage that you get by subscribing to a Patreon or an article website or some, you know, watching YouTubers that talk about it. It doesn't have to be just me. There's plenty of people out there that have been in the game a long time and can just naturally kind of tell how a metagame is going to work out. So I made this flow chart, which I think was probably one of the most valuable parts of my Patreon leading up to Players Cup 3. This depicts how I expected the behavior to play out in deck selection for the top 256 North American Regional. So we start with the top performing deck. Now this kind of flowchart can work for any metagame. So the top performing deck of the meta, that was at the time Eternatus Hammers. This was the most popular and the top performing deck, straight Eternatus Hammers. This being a good deck would cause people to play Luke Metal and Decigoons. This would cause a small population to switch off from Eternatus to Poison Eternatus to have a better chance against these two decks, while also staying true to the archetype that they were originally playing. Luke Metal and Decigoons would cause people to play, or I should say the idea of people switching to Luke Metal and Decigoons on account of Eternatus would cause people to play Centiskorch VMAX and Blounds, which have a bit of a shaky matchup versus Eternatus, but very good matchup versus Luke Metal and Decigoons as a group. Centiskorch VMAX and Blounds being played lumped together as welder decks that use Giant Hearth would cause Chaotic Swell to be included in more lists. And this would cause people, the Centiskorch and VMAX would cause people to play Pika-Rom more, because Pika-Rom is favored versus both of these. Now, Pika-Rom would fall off with the increase of Eternatus and Zacian decks, and we would cycle right back to Eternatus being popular again. And ADPZ out here, unaffected by time and space. There will also frequently be a deck like this in the format that just doesn't care what people are playing, and you can just lock that deck. In 2010, Lux Chomp. In 2018, Zoroark. In 20, I want to say 13, Darkrai EX. There's always a deck that even its poor matchups are not that poor, that can just kind of grind through anything that people will play regardless, because it's a safe deck and will always have that nice chunk of that meta share in that format. So ADPZ is that deck that really doesn't go up and down too much depending on what's happening here. Now, this is something I consider fairly factual. If people play Eternatus Hammers, there will be people that want to counter it with Luke Metal. If people play Luke Metal, there will be people that play Fire decks. If people play Fire decks, there will be people that play Pika-Rom. If there are people that play Pika-Rom, we'll come right back to Eternatus, and Decigoons for that matter. The challenge is deciding where in that circle does it stop. Will it stop on people playing Eternatus Hammers? Will it stop over here on the counters? Will it stop at the counter to the counter? Will it stop on the counter to the counter to the counter? Or will it just cycle right back to the original meta pick? So that is the most challenging part here. This is just something that I naturally see whenever there's a standard format. When there's a meta game, you know, this is just naturally how it works. But deciding where to cut your losses and where you think this cycle will stop was the most important thing. So I expected the cycle to stop on Centiskorch VMAX and Blounds, and quite frankly, I expected it to stop there because that's where I stopped. There are sometimes way too often where I will go ahead of the metagame, and like, let's say that I cycled all the way back to Eternatus Hammers, but the rest of the population was still at Luke Metal and Decigoons. That would be bad if I went too far ahead. But 3 people of my group decided to stop on the Fire section. That was myself, Danny Altavia, and then my mom, Joan Morsa. We all played 59 out of the same 60 cards in our deck list. Unfortunately, Danny and I got knocked out, and my mom made it to top 16 North America, where she then got knocked out by an Inteleon VMAX deck. So Centiskorch VMAX and Blounds was the place where I thought most people would stop. Or the majority of people that were still floating around for deck lists, I would say, that didn't already lock in an archetype. I thought Centiskorch and Blounds would be a very popular place for people to stop. And I think that turned out to be true. I saw several groups bring either Centiskorch VMAX or Blounds/Tempozard for the event, which in that case, my friend and also part of the group I was discussing with, Mike Fouché, he picked Pika-Rom. So, you know, we did think a lot of people would end on the Fire, but we just wanted to make our Fire decks better and more consistent instead of switching over to Pika-Rom, because at least I can talk for myself. With Pika-Rom, I didn't want to hit a lot of Eternatus and have all of those matchups rely on, did I flip a Crushing Hammer early enough to stop them from overrunning me? Also, the threat of Decigoons, which is fairly small, but another one is ADPZ gaining Rusted Sword, was also a little scary for me in terms of playing Pika-Rom. And Centiskorch VMAX and Blounds were two decks that I thought could handle just about anything. Now, not to say that they were favored versus it, I definitely think Centiskorch is unfavored versus Pika-Rom and unfavored versus Eternatus, but I thought that it could handle just about anything, give me a chance in a best 2 out of 3. And also best 2 out of 3 felt very appealing for a welder deck, because even if I have a poor game due to the inconsistency of the deck, I could feel like I could bring it back in the other games 2 and 3. Now, the last thing to decide was, do I go with a Blound variant or do I go with Centiskorch? And I was really back and forth on this for a while. And the thing that led me to stop on Centiskorch was I felt like they were very similar decks, and by the end of it all, we had built our Centiskorch VMAX deck and our Tempo-Zard / Blound deck to be fairly similar with each other. They were both running Reshizard and Cramorant in some capacity. The difference was Blounds and extra fire crystals, or the Centiskorch VMAX line, which we did cut down to a thinner 3-2 line. And I decided with Centiskorch VMAX because I felt it was less susceptible to Marnies and Stamps, because you can set up a big Centiskorch VMAX and it sticks to the board, whereas Blound is a one-turn investment. You might have to put a lot into it to get the knockout with it and set it up and welder to it, but then it typically only lasts for one turn and can be met with like a Stamp Plant or a Marnie Plant play. So I felt Centiskorch VMAX actually circumvented a little bit of the luck factor, and so I went with, Centiskorch VMAX as opposed to a Blound variant. So that's how I ended up picking my deck. And down here, just some further explanation that my top choices were Centiskorch, Blound, and Pika-Rom. And I did believe that the best deck in format for the Team Up Through Shining Fates standard format was straight Eternatus Hammers. I do think that was the best deck in format, but it was too polarizing for me for this kind of event. I didn't want to run into Luke Metals and Decigoons, and also Pika-Rom is a matchup that can just change on a coin flip. ADPZ can beat anything. Another good thing about Centiskorch is I felt it was at the very least slightly favored versus ADP Zacian, which, like I said, I knew was a deck that no matter come wind or storm, people would settle on ADP Zacian. There would be a chunk of people that just went with ADPZ because it was the default deck, which was another good reason for me to play Centiskorch, where I felt like Centiskorch had a slight advantage over ADPZ that Blound variants did not. So that is how I ended up selecting my deck, and that was the information that I was able to provide my patrons with leading up to PC3 to help them with their deck selection. So I hope this video helped you a little bit see the inner workings of my mind and how I select a deck for an important tournament like the PC3 Top 256. Like I said, I'll be doing a lot of this analysis for PC4, both qualifier and Top 256 phase, for my patrons in the coming month or so leading up to Players Cup 4. So if you're interested in that, consider subscribing to my Patreon over there. But I also do a fair amount of free content over here. I do upload every single day on my YouTube channel for Pokemon TCG content, so be sure to subscribe here so you don't miss any of that content. I'd appreciate a like and a comment if you enjoyed the video, and other than that, just have a great day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.